Andes Mountains, also called the Andes, Spanish Cordillera de los Andes or Los Andes, mountain system of South America and one of the great natural features on Earth. The Andes consist of a vast series of extremely high plateaus surmounted by even higher peaks that form an unbroken rampart over a distance of some 5,500 miles, 8,900 kilometers, from the southern tip of South America to the continent's northernmost coast on the Caribbean. They separate a narrow western coastal area from the rest of the continent, affecting deeply the conditions of life within the ranges themselves and in surrounding areas. The Andes contain the highest peaks in the Western Hemisphere. The highest of them is Mount Aconcagua, 22,831 feet, 6,959 meters, on the border of Argentina and Chile. Height of Mount Aconcagua. The Andes are not a single line of formidable peaks, but rather a succession of parallel and transverse mountain ranges, or cordilleras, and of intervening plateaus and depressions. Distinct eastern and western ranges, respectively named the Cordillera Oriental and the Cordillera Occidental, are characteristic of most of the system. The directional trend of both the cordilleras generally is north-south, but in several places the Cordillera Oriental bulges eastward to form either isolated peninsula-like ranges or such high intermontane plateau regions as the Altiplano, Spanish High Plateau, occupying adjoining parts of Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, and Peru. Some historians believe the name Andes comes from the Quechua word anti, east. Others suggest it is derived from the Quechuan anta, copper. It perhaps is more reasonable to ascribe it to the anta of the older Aymara language, which connotes copper color generally. Physical features. There is no universal agreement about the major north-south subdivisions of the Andes system. For the purposes of this discussion, the system is divided into three broad categories. From south to north, these are the southern Andes, consisting of the Chilean, Fuegian, and Patagonian Cordilleras, the central Andes, including the Peruvian Cordilleras, and the northern Andes, encompassing the Ecuadorian, Colombian, and Venezuelan, or Caribbean, Cordilleras. The Andean mountain system is the result of global plate tectonic forces during the Cenozoic era, roughly the past 65 million years, that built upon earlier geologic activity. About 250 million years ago, the crustal plates constituting the Earth's landmass were joined together into the supercontinent Pangaea. The subsequent breakup of Pangaea and of its southern portion, Gondwana, dispersed these plates outward, where they began to take the form and position of the present-day continents. The collision, or convergence, of two of these plates, the continental South American plate and the oceanic Nazca plate, gave rise to the orogenic, mountain-building activity that produced the Andes. Many of the rocks comprising the present-day Cordilleras are of great age. They began as sediments eroded from the Amazonia Craton, or Brazilian Shield, the ancient granitic continental fragment that constitutes much of Brazil, and deposited between about 450 and 250 million years ago on the Craton's western flank. The weight of these deposits forced a subsidence, downwarping, of the crust, and the resulting pressure and heat metamorphosed the deposits into more resistant rocks. Thus, sandstone, siltstone, and limestone were transformed, respectively, into quartzite, shale, and marble. Approximately 170 million years ago, this complex geologic matrix began to be uplifted as the eastern edge of the Nazca Plate was forced under the western edge of the South American Plate, i.e., the Nazca Plate was subducted, the result of the latter plate's westward movement in response to the opening of the Atlantic Ocean to the east. This subduction uplift process was accompanied by the intrusion of considerable quantities of magma from the mantle, first in the form of a volcanic arc along the western edge of the South American plate and later by the injection of hot solutions into surrounding continental rocks. The latter process created numerous dikes and veins containing concentrations of economically valuable minerals that later were to play a critical role in the human occupation of the Andes. The Fuegian Andes begin on the mountainous Estados, Staten Island, the easternmost point of the Tierra del Fuego archipelago, reaching an elevation of 3,700 feet. They run to the west through Grande Island, where the highest ridges, including Mounts Darwin, Valdiviso, and Sarando, are all less than 7,900 feet high. The physiography of this southernmost subdivision of the Andes system is complicated by the presence of the independent Sierra de la Costa. The Patagonian Andes rise north of the Strait of Magellan. Numerous transverse and longitudinal depressions and breaches cut this wild and rugged portion of the Andes, sometimes completely. Many ranges are occupied by ice fields, glaciers, rivers, lakes, or fjords. The crests of the mountains exceed 10,000 feet, Mount Fitzroy reaching 11,073 feet, north to latitude 46 degrees south but average only 6,500 to 8,400 feet from latitude 46 degrees to 41 degrees south, except for Mount Tronador, 11,453 feet. North of Lake Ilumine, Argentina, the axis of the Cordillera shifts to the east up to a zone of transition between latitude 37 degrees and 35 degrees south, where the geographic aspect and geomorphic structure change. This zone marks the most commonly accepted northern extent of the Patagonian Andes. There is some disagreement, however, about this limit, some placing it farther south, at the Gulf of Penis, 47 degrees south, and others considering it to be to the north, around 30 degrees S. The line of permanent snow becomes higher in elevation with decreasing latitude in the southern Andes, 2,300 feet in Tierra del Fuego, 5,000 feet at Osorno volcano, 41 degrees south, and 12,000 feet at Demuyo volcano, 36 degrees 38 feet S. A line of active volcanoes, including Yaite, Corcovado, and Maca, occurs about 40 degrees to 46 degrees south. The southernmost of these, Mount Hudson of Chile, erupted in 1991. Enormous ice fields are located between Mount Fitzroy, called Mount Chaltén in Chile, and Lake Buenos Aires, Lake General Carrera in Chile. At both sides of Baker Fjord, the Viedma, Uppsala, and other glaciers originate from these fields. Other notable features are the more than 50 lakes found south of 39 degrees S. Those depressions that are free of water form fertile valleys called vegas, which are easily reached by low passes. Magnificent and impenetrable forests grow on both sides of these cordilleras, especially on the western slopes. These forests cover the mountains as high as the snowline, although at the higher altitudes toward the north and in Tierra del Fuego the vegetation is lower and less dense. Both Argentina and Chile have created national parks to preserve the area's natural beauty. The central Andes begin at latitude 35 degrees south, at a point where the Cordillera undergoes a sharp change of character. Its width increases to about 50 miles, and it becomes arid and higher. The passes, too, are higher and more difficult to cross. Glaciers are rare and found only at high elevations. The main range serves as the boundary between Chile and Argentina and also as the drainage divide between rivers flowing to the Pacific and the Atlantic. The last of the southern series of volcanoes, Mount Tupungato, 21,555 feet, is just east of Santiago, Chile. A line of lofty, snow-capped peaks rise between Tupungato and the mighty Mount Aconcagua. To the north of Aconcagua lies Mount Mercedario, 22,211 feet, and between them are the high passes of Mount Espinacito, 16,000 feet, and Mount Patos, 12,825 feet. South of Aconcagua the passes include Purcas, 16,960 feet, Bermejo, more than 10,000 feet, and Iglesia, 13,400 feet. Farther north the passes are more numerous but higher. The peaks of Mounts Bonet, Ojos del Salado, and Pisces surpass 20,000 feet. The peak of Tres Cruces, 22,156 feet, at 27 degrees south latitude marks the culmination of this part of the Cordillera. To the north is found a transverse depression in the southern limit of the high plateau region called the Atacama Plateau in Argentina and Chile and the Altiplano in Bolivia and Peru. The Cordillera grows wider as it advances into Bolivia and Peru, where the Great Plateau is bounded by two ranges, the Occidental and the Oriental. Northward, to latitude 18 degrees south, the peaks of El Condor, Sierra Nevada, Lulelaco, Galan, and Antofalla all exceed 19,000 feet. The two main ranges and several volcanic secondary chains enclose depressions called salars because of the deposits of salts they contain. In northwestern Argentina, the Sierra de Caloloste encompasses the large Antofalla salt flat. Volcanoes of this zone occur mostly on a northerly line along the Cordillera Occidental as far as Misti Volcano. Latitude 16 degrees south, in Peru. The western slopes of the Cordillera Occidental descend gradually to the Atacama Desert along the coast. At about 18 degrees south, the trend of the Cordillera Occidental changes to a northwesterly direction. The Cordillera Oriental to the east, lower and built on a broad bed of lava, is cut and denuded by rivers with steep gradients, fed by heavy rainfall. It has two sections. The southern portion is 150 miles wide and, with the exception of Coral Peak in Bolivia, 18,414 feet of relatively low elevation. The northern section in Bolivia, called Cordillera Real, is narrow, with higher peaks and glaciers. The most important peaks, at over 21,000 feet, are Mounts Illimani and Ilimpu. At about latitude 22 degrees south, the Cordillera Oriental penetrates into Bolivia and describes a wide semicircle to the north and then to the northwest. To the west the Altiplano reaches its broadest extent. The Altiplano, 500 miles long and 80 miles wide, is one of the largest interior basins of the world. Varying in elevation from 11,200 to 12,800 feet, it has no drainage outlet to the ocean. Roughly in the center of the plateau is a great depression between the two Cordilleras. Lake Titicaca, the highest navigable lake of the world, 110 miles long, fills the northern part of the depression. The Desaguadero River flows south through the depression, draining Titicaca water into the smaller Lake Pupo. North of the Pasco Knot, three different ranges run along the plateau. The Cordilleras Occidental, Central, and Oriental. In the Cordillera Occidental, at latitude 10 degrees south, the deep, narrow Huaylas Valley separates two ranges, Cordillera Blanca to the east and Cordillera Negra to the west. The Santa River runs between them and cuts Cordillera Negra to drain into the Pacific. Cordillera Blanca is a complex highland with permanently snow-capped peaks, some among the highest of the Andes, e.g., Mount Huascaran, at 22,205 feet. At times, the glaciers that rise there are broken off by earthquakes and rush down the slopes, demolishing vegetation and settlements in their paths. Cordillera Negra, so named because it is not covered with snow, is lower. The Peruvian Andes traditionally have been described as three Cordilleras, which come together at the Vilcanota, Pasco, and Loja, Ecuador, knots. The Pasco Knot is a large, high plateau. To the west, it is bounded by the Cordillera Huarochirí, on the west slope of which the Remitz River rises in a cluster of lakes fed by glaciers and descends rapidly to the ocean, 15,700 feet in 60 miles. Taiklio Pass, at an altitude of some 15,800 feet, is used by a railway. Many small lakes and ponds are found on the knots, with Lake Junin, about 20 miles long, being the largest. The permanent snow line reaches an altitude of 19,000 feet in Mount Chanchani, about latitude 16 degrees S, and declines to about 15,000 feet in Cordillera Blanca and to 13,000 feet on Mount Huascaran. Permanent snow is less common north of 8 degrees south, the Puna grasslands end, and the so-called humid Puna, or Jalca, begins. Mountains become wider and smoother in appearance, while vegetation changes to heathland and trees. The altitude diminishes, and passes are much lower, as at Porcula Pass, 7,000 feet east of Piura. Physiography of the northern Andes. A rough and eroded high mass of mountains called the Lojanop, 4 degrees south, in southern Ecuador marks the transition between the Peruvian Cordilleras and the Ecuadorian Andes. The Ecuadorian system consists of a long, narrow plateau running from south to north bordered by 2 mountain chains containing numerous high volcanoes. To the west, in the geologically recent and relatively low Cordillera Occidental, stands a line of 19 volcanoes, 7 of them exceeding 15,000 feet in elevation. The eastern border is the higher and older Cordillera Central, capped by a line of 20 volcanoes. Some of these, such as Chimborazo volcano, 20,702 feet, have permanent snowcaps. The outpouring of lava from these volcanoes has divided the central plateau into 10 major basins that are strung in bead-like fashion between the 2 Cordilleras. These basins and their adjacent slopes, which are intensively cultivated, contain roughly half of Ecuador's population. A third Cordillera has been identified in the eastern jungle of Ecuador and has been named the Cordillera Oriental. The range appears to be an ancient alluvial formation that has been divided by rivers and heavy rainfall into a number of mountain masses. Such masses as the Cordilleras of Guacamayo, Galeras, and Lumbaki are isolated or form irregular short chains and are covered by luxuriant forest. Altitudes do not exceed 7,900 feet, except at Cordilleras del Condor, 13,000 feet, and Mount Pax, 11,000 feet. North of the boundary with Colombia is a group of high, snow-capped volcanoes, Azufral, Cumbal, Chiles, known as the Huaca Knot. Farther to the north is the Great Massif of the Pasto Mountains, latitude 1 degree to 2 degrees north, which is the most important Colombian physiographic complex and the source of many of the country's rivers. 3 distinct ranges, the Cordilleras Occidental, Central, and Oriental, run northward. The Cordillera Occidental, parallel to the coast and moderately high, reaches an elevation of nearly 13,000 feet at Mount Paramillo before descending in 3 smaller ranges into the lowlands of northern Colombia. The Cordillera Central is the highest, average altitude of almost 10,000 feet, but also the shortest range of Colombian Andes, stretching some 400 miles before its most northerly spurs disappear at about latitude 8 degrees N. Most of the volcanoes of the zone are in this range, including Mounts Tolima, 17,105 feet, Ruiz, 17,717 feet, and Hula, 18,865 feet. At about latitude 6 degrees north, the range widens into a plateau on which Medellin is situated. Between the Cordilleras Central and Occidental is a great depression, the Patia Cauca Valley, divided into 3 longitudinal plains. The southernmost is the narrow valley of the Patia River, the waters of which flow to the Pacific. The middle plain is the highest in elevation, 8,200 feet, and constitutes the divide of the other two. The northern plain, the largest, 15 miles wide and 125 miles long, is the valley of Cauca River, which drains northward to the Magdalena River.